Wouldn't it be horrible if the number of Americans without a job was higher today than it was during the Great Recession of 2008-2009? Well, that is actually true. As you will see below, nearly 102 million Americans do not have a job right now, and at no point during the last recession did that number ever surpass the 100 million mark. Of course, the US population has grown a bit over the last decade, but as you will see below, the percentage of the population that's engaged in the labor force is only slightly above the depressingly low levels from the last recession. Sadly, the truth is that the rosy employment statistics that you're getting from the mainstream media are manufactured using smoke and mirrors, and by the time you're done watching this video, you'll understand what is really going on. Yeah, it is true that the economic numbers have gotten slightly better since Donald Trump entered the White House, but the rosy economic picture that the mainstream media is constantly painting for all of us is completely absurd. As you are about to see, if honest numbers were being used, all of our major economic numbers would be absolutely terrible. Of course, we can hope for a major economic turnaround for America under Donald Trump, but we certainly are not there yet. Economist John Williams of ShadowStats.com has been tracking what our key economic numbers would look like if honest numbers were being used for many years, and he has gained a sterling reputation for being accurate. And according to him, it looks like the US economy has been in a recession and/or depression for a very long time. Let's start by talking about unemployment. We're being told that the unemployment rate in the United States is currently 3.8%, which would be the lowest that it has been in nearly 50 years. Doesn't that sound great? It would be great if the numbers that they were using were honest. The truth, of course, is that the percentage of the population that is employed has barely budged since the depths of the last recession. According to John Williams, if honest numbers were being used, the unemployment rate would actually be 21.2% today. So, what is the reason for the gaping disparity? Before we answer this question, let's talk about what we just learned. According to CNBC, initial claims for unemployment benefits just rose by the most that we've seen in 19 months. Initial claims for state unemployment benefits jumped 37,000 to a seasonally adjusted 230,000 for the week ending April 20th, the Labor Department said on Thursday. The increase was the largest since early September 2017. And considering all of the other troubling economic signs that we've been witnessing lately, this makes perfect sense. In addition, we need to remember that over the last decade, lawmakers across the country have made it more difficult to apply for unemployment benefits and have reduced the amount of time that unemployed workers can receive them. In reality, the unemployment situation in this nation is far worse than the mainstream media is telling us. When a working-age American does not have a job, the federal number crunchers put them into one of two different categories. Either they're categorized as unemployed, or they are categorized as not in the labor force. But you have to add both of those categories together to get the total number of Americans that are not working. Over the last decade, the number of Americans that are in the unemployed category has been steadily going down, but the number of Americans not in the labor force has been rapidly going up. In both cases, we are talking about Americans that do not have a job. It's just a matter of how the federal government chooses to categorize those individuals. At this moment, we are told that only 6.2 million Americans are officially unemployed, and that sounds really, really good. But that is only half the story. What the mainstream media rarely mentions is the fact that the number of Americans categorized as not in the labor force has absolutely exploded since the last recession. Right now, that number is sitting at 95.577 million. When you add 6.2 million officially unemployed Americans to 95.577 million Americans that are categorized as not in the labor force, you get a grand total of almost 102 million Americans that do not have a job right now. If that sounds terrible to you, well, it is, because it is terrible. Yes, the U.S. population's been growing over the last decade. That is part of the reason why the number of Americans not in the labor force has been growing. But overall, the truth is that the level of unemployment in this country is not that much different than it was during the last recession. John Williams of shadowstats.com tracks what the real employment figure would be if honest numbers were being used. And according to him, the real rate of unemployment in the United States at the moment is 21.2%. That is down from where it was a few years ago, but not by that much. Another honest indicator that I'd like to look at is the civilian labor force participation rate. In essence, it tells us what percentage of the working age population is actually engaged in the labor force. Just before the last recession, the civilian labor force participation rate was sitting at about 66%, and that was pretty good. But then the recession hit, and the civilian labor force participation rate fell below 63%, and it stayed between 62 and 63% for an extended period of time. So, where are we today? At this moment, we are sitting at just 63.0%. Does that look like a recovery to you? Of course not. If you would like to claim that we have had a very marginal employment recovery since the last recession, that is a legitimate argument to make, but anything beyond that is simply not being honest. And now, the U.S. economy is rapidly slowing down again, and most Americans are completely and totally unprepared for what is ahead. The good news is that employment levels have been fairly stable in recent years, but the bad news is that unemployment claims are starting to shoot up again. A number of the experts that I'm hearing from expect job losses to escalate in the months ahead. Many of those that are currently living on the edge financially suddenly won't be able to pay their mortgages or their bills. I have a friend down in South Idaho that's a highly trained software engineer. Now, this guy's been out of work for 2 years. If the unemployment rate is really 3.8%, why can't he find a decent job? By the way, if you live in the Boise area and you know of an opening for a quality software engineer, please let me know. I'll get the information to him. Next, let's talk about inflation. According to Williams, the way inflation has been calculated in this country has been repeatedly changed over the decades. Williams argues that U.S. statistical agencies overestimate GDP data by underestimating the inflation deflator they use in the calculation. Manipulating the inflation rate, Williams argues in public comment on inflation measurement, also enables the U.S. government to pay out pensioners less than they were promised by fudging the cost of living adjustments. This manipulation has ironically taken place quite openly over decades as successive Republican and Democratic administrations made improvements in the way they calculated the data. If inflation was still calculated the way that it was in 1990, the inflation rate would be 6% today, instead of about 2%. And if inflation was still calculated the way that it was in 1980, the inflation rate would be about 10% today. Doesn't that feel more accurate to you? We've all seen how prices for housing, food, and healthcare have soared in recent years. After examining what's happened in your own life, do you believe that the official inflation rates of 2% and 3% that we've been given in recent years are anywhere near accurate? Because inflation is massively understated, that has a tremendous effect on our GDP numbers as well. If accurate inflation numbers were being used, we would still be in a recession right now. In fact, John Williams insists that we would still be in a recession that started back in 2004. And without a doubt, a whole host of other more independent indicators point in that direction too. The following comes from an excellent piece by Peter Diekmeyer. Williams' findings, while controversial, corroborate a variety of other data points. Median wage gains have been stagnant for decades. The U.S. labor force participation rate remains at multi-decade lows. Even our own light-hearted Big Mac deflator suggests that the U.S. economy is in a depression. Another clue is to evaluate the U.S. economy just as economists would a third-world nation whose data they don't trust. They do this by resorting to figures that are hard to fudge. There too, by a variety of measures ranging from petroleum consumption to consumer goods production to the Cass Freight Index, the U.S. economy appears to have not grown much, if at all, since the turn of the millennium. In the end, all that any of us really need to do is just open our eyes and look at what's happening all around us. We are on pace for the worst year for retail store closings in American history. Of course, it isn't just the U.S. economy that's troubled either. We're living in the terminal phase of the greatest debt bubble in global history. Many nations around the globe are already experiencing a very deep economic downturn. And our planet is literally in the process of dying. So please, don't believe the hype. Yes, we definitely hope that things will get better, but the truth is that things have not been good for the U.S. economy for a very, very long time. Just like the last recession, we could potentially see millions of middle-class Americans quickly lose everything once economic conditions start getting really bad. The economy is not going to get any better than it is right now. As you look forward to the second half of 2019, I would make plans for rough sailing ahead.